Studios.
Standing outside the railway station in Spencer, North Carolina, the station manager kept looking north up the tracks. The fast mail train was late. The train that carried mail all the way from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, and in 1903, there were very few things that were more important in America than the mail. Every minute behind schedule counted, and every minute late cost the railroad money. So as the station manager checked his pocket watch and waited for the sound of a steam whistle in the distance, the train was somewhere north of Danville, Virginia, trying to make up lost time. Then the telegram came in, and in an instant, the waiting was over. And what was written in that telegram would set off a series of events that stretches into today. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. If you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. September 27th, 1903. It was a Sunday afternoon. The kind of late September day where summer had started loosening its grip across Virginia, but the colder air of fall still hadn't fully settled in yet. The sun hung high above the countryside. The skies were mostly clear. And along the Southern Railway line, people were finishing church services, sitting on porches, and listening for the familiar sound of locomotives rolling through the hills. Back then, trains weren't just transportation. They were the lifeline of the country. Before interstate highways, before commercial airlines, before anyone could pick up a cell phone and call across country, America moved by rail. And one of the most important trains on the Southern Railway system was known simply as the Fast Mail. Train number 97, pulled that day by Southern Railway engine number 1102, a brand new, massive, Baldwin-built steam locomotive fueled by coal, fire, water, and pressure. Inside the engine, the fireman would shovel coal into the roaring firebox while steam built inside the boiler, powering the pistons and driving the wheels that carried the train south down the rails. The fast mail train carried United States mail moving from New York through Washington, D.C., south through Virginia and the Carolinas, eventually making its way to New Orleans. The train consisted of 2 railway post office cars. Cars where highly trained mail service clerks sorted through mail while in transit. An express car, which carried time-sensitive, high-value freight, packages, and bulk mail. And a baggage car, which carried additional packages and mail. And inside those rail cars were letters from loved ones, business records, newspapers, packages, government documents, and messages from people separated by hundreds of miles. In 1903, the mail was more than important. It was how people stayed connected to the world around them. And on that Sunday afternoon, old 97 was running behind schedule. And 97 just wasn't any train on the Southern Railway line. The fast mail had a reputation. It was known as one of the faster trains running the rails at the time, built around speed, schedules, and keeping the mail moving south as quickly as possible. Railroad men knew the importance of number 97, and so did the company. Old 97 was known for running so regularly on schedule that folks leaving along the line set their watches by it. However, on that particular day when train 97 pulled into the station at Monroe, Virginia, it was already running behind. The normal crew assigned to take over the fast mail had been reassigned earlier, so Southern Railway pulled a crew from another train, reportedly a slower freight run, and reassigned them to old 97 in hopes of making up lost time. And sitting at the controls that afternoon was a young railroad engineer, a man trusted enough to take over one of the Southern Railway's most important runs. A man who knew these rails, knew the grades, knew the curves, knew where a locomotive could gain time and where it couldn't. Now, before we go any further, if you're from around these parts of Appalachia, you might be wondering what places like Monroe and Danville, Virginia, have to do with Appalachia at all. Because when you look at a map, Neither of those places are in the Appalachian Mountains. But I'll promise you this, if you stick with me, before this story is over, I'll bring it back home more times than one. So as old 97 sat there in Monroe taking on its replacement crew, railroad officials were already worried about the clock. The Southern Railway carried federal mail contracts, and every minute a train arrived late cost the company money and penalties. Schedules counted. Time mattered. Efficiency was important. So as the steam hissed from engine 1102 and black smoke rolled above the tracks, the crew prepared to leave Monroe with orders that were simple. You're way behind. This is not 38. This is old 97. So put her in Spencer on time. Spencer, North Carolina, that is, sat nearly 4 hours and 15 minutes away under normal conditions. And somehow, the crew of old 97 was expected to make up some of that time. Now, whether anyone stood there and directly ordered that engineer to run that train dangerously fast, nobody could say for certain. But railroad men understood pressure without needing every word spoken out loud. And before long, old 97 pulled south towards Lynchburg in Danville, Virginia, carrying mail, postal clerks, and a schedule that was already in jeopardy. At first, it probably didn't seem all that unusual. People on the tracks were used to hearing steam whistles echo through the Virginia countryside. Locomotives rolled through these towns every day carrying passengers, freight, tobacco, livestock, and mail. But before long, witnesses would begin noticing something different about old 97 that afternoon. She was moving really fast. Now you got to understand something about railroads in 1903. There were no computerized speed controls, no automatic braking system stepping in to slow a train down, no dispatcher sitting behind the screen watching every movement in real time. Once a steam locomotive got moving, especially on a downhill grade, a whole lot of responsibility rested in the hands of the engineer and fireman. And the route south from Lynchburg toward Danville could be dangerous in places even under normal conditions. The tracks wound through rolling valleys and countryside, through curves and descending grades that railroad men along the Southern Railway knew all too well. Some sections allowed an engineer to safely open a locomotive up and make good time. Other sections demanded caution, because once a heavy steam train built momentum going downhill, it could become incredibly hard to slow back down. But old 97 wasn't running on normal time that afternoon. She was trying to outrun the clock. And as the train pushed south out of Monroe and through Lynchburg, witnesses along the route would later describe the train moving faster than they had ever seen. The fast mail wasn't stopping long. In some places, it barely seemed to slow at all, rolling straight through stations and foregoing stops. Smoke rolled from the stack in thick black clouds while the fireman kept feeding coal into the roaring firebox to maintain steam pressure. And somewhere up front inside that locomotive cab, the engineer kept watching the rails unfold ahead of him, mile after mile, curve after curve, trying to claw back time. Now, if you've ever stood beside a steam locomotive before, it's hard to really explain the sound of one working hard. It wasn't just noise. You could feel it. The pounding of the drive wheels against the rails, the hiss of escaping steam, the deep churning rhythm of pistons and metal all moving together while tons of steel and momentum pushed forward down the track. And the faster a steam locomotive moved, the harder it became to stop, especially heading down grade. As old 97 raced south towards Danville that Sunday afternoon, station workers watched the train thunder past faster than expected. Farmers near the tracks later talked about hearing the whistle echoing across the countryside long before the locomotive came into view. Some witnesses would later estimate the train was moving at nearly 90 miles an hour, maybe even faster in places, an incredible speed for that time period. And still, old 97 kept pushing south. And somewhere ahead of them waited Stillhouse Trestle outside of Danville. A trestle that spanned a 50-foot deep ravine with a stream down below. Now the approach into Danville was dangerous even on a normal day. The tracks dropped down grade into a sharp curve leading onto the trestle, and every railroad man on that line knew you had to respect that curve. But old 97 came into it hard. Too hard. According to later reports, the locomotive may have lost air pressure in the braking system, making it harder to control the speed as the fast mail pushed downward towards the curve outside of Danville. As the locomotive thundered towards the trestle, the whistle suddenly began screaming across the countryside in desperate, long blast. People nearby would later remember hearing it and knowing something wasn't right. Then came the curve. The locomotive lurched. Steel screamed against steel, and in an instant, Old 97 left the rails. The engine slammed into the trestle with such force that the entire train began tearing itself apart. Wooden cars splintered. Mail cars piled forward. Steel twisted into the ravine below as the locomotive plunged over the embankment and dragged the rest of the train behind it. Then, almost as quickly as it happened, it was over. Steam hissed from the wreckage. Broken timbers lay scattered across the hillside. Mailbags, luggage, and debris covered the ravine below the tracks. And where the sound of Old 97 had filled the countryside only moments before, there was now only wreckage, steam, and the cries. In the moments after the crash, people nearby began rushing towards the wreckage. Railroad workers, men from nearby homes and farms who had heard the sound of twisting steel and knew immediately that something terrible had happened near the trestle. And what they found below the tracks was sheer devastation. Old 97 laid shattered in the ravine outside of Danville. Pieces of the locomotive and rail cars scattered down the hillside beneath the broken trestle. Some survivors managed to crawl from the wreckage on their own. Others were trapped. The locomotive itself had taken the worst of the impact, and the crew riding inside the cab never really had a chance. Rescue workers climbed through steam and debris, trying to pull the injured free, while others gathered the dead from the wreckage. As rescue crews worked through the wreckage below the trestle, scattered mailbags, letters, and packages lay torn open across the ravine. Railroad workers and postal clerks quickly began gathering whatever mail they could salvage, because even after a disaster like this, the mail still had to keep moving. Many of the mail patches had been ripped apart in the crash, though much of the mail itself was eventually recovered. And among the wreckage were express crates carrying canary birds. The birds were still alive beneath parts of the collapsed railcar debris and could be heard singing while rescue workers searched through the wreckage of Old 97. By the end of it, 11 people were dead, and 7 others were seriously injured in what quickly became one of the worst railroad disasters in Virginia history. 3 of the survivors reportedly jumped from the train before it left its tracks. And while rescue crews worked the scene outside of Danville, hundreds of miles away in Spencer, North Carolina, people were still waiting on the fast mail. At the Southern Railway Station in Spencer, the station manager kept watching the tracks and checking the clock. Old 97 should have been there already. Mail crews were standing by. Railroad workers waited for the train that carried mail south through the region every single day. But Old 97 never arrived. Instead, a telegram finally came across the wire. The fast mail had wrecked outside Danville. And almost immediately, the story began spreading across the country the same way all major news traveled in 1903, by telegraph and newspaper. Reports of the disaster moved from station to station as newspapers rushed to print details about the wreck of Old 97. Before long, people everywhere were asking the same question. How could one of Southern Railway's most important trains have crashed so violently? And it didn't take long for the blame to enter the conversation. Southern Railway officials quickly began investigating the disaster, and early reports focused heavily on speed. The train, they claimed, had entered the curb near Steelhouse Trestle far too fast. In other words, the railroad's position was already becoming clear. The man at the controls would carry the blame. The man Southern Railway would ultimately place at the center of the disaster was the engineer of Old 97, Joseph Steve Brawdy. Brawdy died in the wreck. He was 33 years old when Old 97 wrecked outside of Danville. He was never married and had no children. One newspaper report from 1903 stated that engineer Joseph Steve Brawdy stuck to his post during the final moments of Old 97. In other words, he never jumped. Brawdy stayed with the locomotive until the very end as the fast mail went into the ravine outside of Danville. Many of the newspaper accounts at the same time seemed to recognize one thing. The engineer rode Old 97 all the way down. And like so many working men from that era, most of what survives about his life now comes from newspaper reports, railroad records, and the story people kept telling long after he was gone. And in 1903, that kind of work carried responsibility that most people today can barely imagine. The engineer sitting inside the cab of a steam locomotive wasn't just driving a train. He was responsible for the passengers behind him, the crew beside him, the cargo in the rail cars, the timetable he was expected to keep, and the thousands of pounds of steel and momentum moving beneath his hands. Railroad work was dangerous, even on an ordinary day. Men were burned by steam, crushed by rail cars, killed in derailments, thrown from locomotives, and if something went wrong, there usually wasn't much room for excuses, especially on a train carrying the United States mail. In the days after the wreck, newspapers across the country began printing details about Old 97 and the disaster outside of Danville. Stories described the tremendous speed of the train as it entered the curve near Steelhouse Trestle, and almost immediately attention centered on Brodie himself. Southern Railway officials maintained the locomotive had simply been operated way too fast. In other words, the engineer had pushed the train beyond what the track could safely handle. Now, whether that was entirely fair has been debated for more than a century. Because yes, the engineer ultimately controlled the locomotive. Nobody forced his hand on the throttle. Nobody physically made him run Old 97 at dangerous speeds. But at the same time, railroads in that era operated under intense pressure to maintain schedules, and the railroad culture rewarded men who could keep trains moving. Whatever exactly happened inside the cab of Old 97 during those final moments approaching Danville died with the crew aboard the locomotive. There would be investigations, newspaper reports, testimony, speculation. Some believed the brakes failed. Others believed the train simply entered the curve too fast, trying to make up lost time. But one thing was certain. Joseph Steve Brodie would forever be linked to the wreck of Old 97. And for most stories, that would have been the end of it. For most railroad wrecks, the story ends when the wreckage gets cleared away. The tracks get repaired, the newspapers move on, and eventually, people forget. But somehow, Old 97 stuck around. Maybe it was the speed, maybe it was the violence of the crash, or maybe it was because railroad men all across the South understood exactly how something like this could happen. Whatever the reason, people kept talking about Old 97 long after the wreck outside Danville had been cleaned up. And the story began traveling far beyond the railroad tracks where it had happened. But in the early 1900s, stories like this didn't just live in newspapers. They lived in conversations, in railroad depots, on front porches, in tobacco warehouses, and eventually in music. Long before radio stations carried country music across America, people passed stories down through ballads, train wrecks, mining disasters, murders, floods. Stories like those traveled from town to town through songs long before most people ever heard a commercial recording. And before long, the wreck of Old 97 became one of those songs. And one musician in particular would eventually help carry the story of Old 97. Henry Whitter was one of many musicians at the time performing traditional songs and ballads that had been passed from person to person for years. Back then, music wasn't something most people streamed through headphones or heard blasting through car speakers. A lot of it lived in homes, in gathering places, and in small communities where songs were learned by ear and passed down the same way the stories were. And railroad ballads were especially popular. People sang about train wrecks because trains represented progress, danger, distance, loss, and sometimes death all at once. Railroad men were respected. Train wrecks were terrifying, and songs about disasters had a way of sticking in people's minds. Somewhere along the line, Henry Whitter picked up the ballad of Old 97. And in 1923, he made a decision that probably seemed almost impossible at the time. He left his job at a cotton mill and traveled north to New York City, hoping to record music professionally. Now, that might not sound unusual today, but back then, commercial recordings were still a relatively new industry. Most musicians never imagined they would record records for a national audience. The music industry largely focused on vaudeville acts, opera singers, orchestras, and more polished popular performers. Not railroad ballads, and certainly not songs that sounded like something you'd hear in the mountains. But Witter believed in what he was doing enough to walk into OK Records unannounced and push for a recording session himself. And eventually, he got one. Using the early recording equipment of the 1920s, Witter recorded The Wreck of Old 97, helping turn a railroad disaster from 1903 into one of the earliest commercially successful country recordings in American history. The Wreck of Old 97 was released in January of 1924. And nobody fully realized it at the time, but something important was beginning to happen. Record companies were slowly discovering that people wanted to hear Southern music, working class music, folk music, songs that sounded real, and The Wreck of Old 97 was helping lead the way. At first, it was simply another railroad ballad pressed onto a record, but people connected with it. Maybe because trains were still such a huge part of everyday life. Maybe because almost everybody understood the fear of a train running too fast. Or maybe because there was something haunting about the story itself. A man trying to make up lost time, a whistle screaming through Virginia, and disaster awaiting around a curve outside of Danville. Whatever the reason, the song stuck. And before long, other musicians started recording their own versions too. The most famous would come from the singer named Vernon Dalhart, whose recording of The Wreck of Old 97 exploded in popularity across the country. Suddenly, what had once been a railroad disaster from 1903 had turned into one of the biggest songs in America. And according to many historians, Dalhart's version of The Wreck of Old 97 became the first country music record to ever sell more than 1 million copies. Think about that for a moment. A song about a train wreck outside of Danville, Virginia, a story passed around through railroad men and newspapers, had now become one of the biggest records in the country. People who had never set foot anywhere near Virginia now knew the name Old 97. But the bigger The Wreck Old 97 became, the messier the story around it started to get. Because by the mid-1920s, this was just no longer a railroad ballad people sang in homes or in depot houses. Now, there was money involved. Henry Witter had helped bring the song into early commercial recording, but it was Vernon Dalhart's hugely successful version for the Victor Talking Machine Company that turned The Wreck of Old 97 into a national phenomenon. And once records started selling by the hundreds of thousands, people started asking a simple question: who actually wrote the song? And the truth was, nobody seemed completely sure anymore. Some believed the lyrics had simply been passed down orally for years after the wreck. Others claimed they had personally written the ballad shortly after the disaster outside Danville. One of the strongest claims came from a man named David Graves George. George was a railroad telegraph operator from the Danville area, and according to his claim, he visited a wreck scene not long after Old 97 had went over the trestle. He was also a singer, and later said that what he saw there inspired him to write the ballad that carried the wreck far beyond Danville. But trying to prove the ownership of a folk ballad years after it had already been spread from person to person wasn't easy, especially in a time before recordings, copyrights, and written documentation were handled the way they are today. The song had already taken on a life of its own, and now everybody wanted a piece of it. David George even won a $65,000 judgment against a Victor Talking Machine Company over the song. But the case was appealed again and again, and that early victory was later undone. Eventually, the legal fight over The Wreck of Old 97 grew so large that it made its way through the federal court system and all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Think about that for a second. A train wreck outside of Danville, a ballad carried through the South for years, had now ended up in the highest court in the country. In the end, the court sided with the Victor Talking Machine Company, ruling there wasn't enough evidence to overturn the company's rights connected to Dalhart's recording of the song. And now, I told you, if you would stick with me, I would bring this back home to Appalachia. So here it goes. As the years passed, Henry Whitter kept recording music while the popularity of Southern string music and railroad ballads continued growing across the country. And by the late 1920s, record companies had started paying attention to something they once ignored completely. People wanted to hear rural Southern music. They wanted songs that sounded real, songs that sounded like home. In 1927, Whitter would eventually take part in the now famous Bristol Sessions in Bristol, Tennessee, inside the Taylor Christian Hat and Glove Company on State Street, which is the street that separates Bristol, Virginia from Bristol, Tennessee. The Bristol Sessions were recordings that many historians still refer to as the Big Bang of country music. Artists like the Carter family and Jimmie Rodgers would emerge from those sessions and help shape what country music would eventually become. But by the time Bristol happened, Henry Whitter was already there ahead of the curve. He had already been recording Southern music years earlier, already recording railroad ballads, already proven there was a market for what the record companies at the time called hillbilly music. And some historians argue that without early artists like Henry Whitter, recordings like The Wreck of Old 97 and the growing commercial success of Southern music in the early 20s, the Bristol Sessions of 1927 might never have happened the way they did. Because Bristol wasn't some random discovery. It was part of a larger movement by record companies searching for more of the raw Southern sound they had already realized people wanted to hear. And somehow, a train wreck outside of Danville, Virginia, had helped become part of that story. Around that same time, Whitter began performing and recording with a blind fiddler named G.B. Grayson, one of the most respected old-time musicians of the era. Together, Grayson and Whitter recorded songs that would eventually become foundational pieces of early Appalachian and country music history. But tragedy seemed to follow so many of the stories connected to Old 97. In 1930, G.B. Grayson was killed in an automobile accident near Damascus, Virginia, after reportedly stepping from a vehicle to clear a fallen tree from the road. After Grayson's death, Henry Whitter never made another commercial recording ever again. And over time, many of the people connected to the story of Old 97 slowly faded into history. The music industry moved on. Newer artists came along, and one of the men who helped carry the Wreck of Old 97 into American history slowly faded from the spotlight himself. Henry Whitter died on November 17, 1941, in Morganton, North Carolina, from complications from diabetes. And today, a lot of people know the song without ever knowing the name of the man who first helped preserve it on record. But there is still a couple of final pieces left of this story. And by this point, you may have realized something. Henry Whitter, the man who helped carry the Wreck of Old 97 into early recorded music, wasn't from New York, wasn't from Nashville, wasn't from some major music city at all. He was from Fries, Virginia, a small mill town tucked away in Grayson County in the mountains of Appalachia. And somehow, a story that started with a train wreck outside of Danville, Virginia, had traveled into the mountains, into Appalachian music, and eventually into the beginnings of country music history itself. But Henry Whitter wasn't the only Appalachian connection hidden inside the story of Old 97. Because the man who many had blamed for the wreck, the railroad engineer whose name had been carried through songs, courtrooms, newspaper stories, and recordings for more than 100 years, well, he too was from Appalachia. Joseph Steve Braudy was from Washington County, Virginia. And after all these years, after all the songs and all the stories, he eventually came back home, buried there in the Lynchburg section of Washington County. Not long ago, I made the trip there myself. The cemetery sits quiet now, easy to pass if you didn't know what you were looking for. No crowds, No railroad whistles, no newspaper headlines, just another hillside, private family cemetery tucked away in southwestern Virginia. And standing there beside his grave, it changes the story a little, because suddenly, Old 97 doesn't feel like some distant railroad legend anymore. It feels close, almost personal. And as strange as it may sound, the locomotive itself wasn't the end of the story either. Southern Railway eventually rebuilt engine 1102 and returned it to service after the wreck of Old 97, where it served the railroad for another 32 years. The railroad moved on. The tracks were repaired. The schedules continued. But the story never disappeared. For more than a century, people have kept singing about the wreck of Old 97. Artists from different generations continued recording the song long after Henry Witter first carried it into a recording studio. From Vernon Dalhart's million-selling record in the 1920s to later versions by artists like Johnny Cash, Flatt and Scruggs, Boxcar Willie, and others. The story continued traveling from one generation to the next long after the wreck itself had faded into history. The story survived through it all. And most people who had heard those songs probably never realized that the man blamed for the wreck and one of the men responsible for preserving the story through music came from right here in Appalachia. A railroad wreck outside of Danville, a ballad carried through the mountains, a song that helped shape early country music, and a railroad engineer who finally came home. More than 100 years later, the whistle of Old 97 has long since faded from the tracks, but the song still survives. So as we close out this episode, I want to let you hear the ballad that carried the wreck of Old 97 across generations, the same song that traveled from railroad depots and front porches, the original 1923 recorded version. The story never disappeared, because here in Appalachia, the roots remained, and the shadows never fully leave.
They give him his orders at Monroe, Virginia, saying, Steve, you're away my time. This is not 38, but it's old 97. You must put her in Spencer on time. Steve looked unfit to his black beaded palm and just shoveling a little more coal. And when we cross that White Oak Mountain, you can watch on 97 road. It's a mighty rough road from Lynchburg to Danville and a line.
This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.